one.
Right. So what we have discussed in the earlier sessions about test cases we have discussed.
Right.
After that, we have discussed even test planning, etc. And today I'm going to discuss about UAT, which stands for User Acceptance Testing. Normally, whenever there is a testing we do, this is nothing to do with technology. This is nothing to do with domain.
Right.
Even in the field of healthcare, while we are working on the applications, user acceptance testing is essentially required. And one of the prominent test environment finally before we are delivering the work.
Right.
So which is called user acceptance testing. Means once the work is done, we need to ensure whether whatever the application we have taken, is it according to the requirements of the customer or not? That we have to ensure.
Yeah.
So for that, generally, user acceptance testing is what generally we do. So which is called user acceptance testing. In this user acceptance testing, we will be knowing about what user wants and what is that we did. But both must be the same end of the day, right? So then only
Right.
this testing will be considered as pass, right? So that's
Yeah.
what generally it was. So in this user acceptance testing template, of course, it starts with the table of contents. You know that. Let me explain you about TOC for 2 minutes, then I'll get into the next one.
Okay.
So in this, there are different points. The first point, explain about the general information because we need to update and mention about the version number, right? At the same time, what are the further revisions do we have, right? So whatever the document sign of approvals, all these things are comes under the general information, which is point number one.
Right.
After that, we will be going to the introduction, where in this introduction, we have to mention about the document description part. And about, we have to update about the project summary as well, whatever the project are we working on, followed by the kind of list of features which are involved in it.
Right.
At the same time, related documentation, something like whatever the business and functional requirements do we have, and technical solution designs, right? So at the same time, test scripts, test plans, whatever the test planning and test scripts were prepared earlier and were completed. At the same time, technical solution designing, because whenever we are working on the application design, solution design is also one of the key and prominent element. So technical
Right.
solution designing is also this is also one of the key element wherein we need to mention apart from business and functional requirements, all that. Next, about scope of user acceptance testing, right? What is the possible scope for user acceptance testing, wherein we need to identify the kind of applications and modules which are getting affected here. Followed by
Yeah.
this, what are the different features to be tested, right? What features not to be tested? Because there are some testable features and conditions applied and some may not, right? So that
Right.
scope of user acceptance testing we need to mention. Next, we have to update about the responsibilities. An important point about configuration setup, right? So configuration setup majorly focuses on hardware, software, right? Testing environment, what kind of tools we have used. At the same time, it also explain about the kind of security aspects of the application, documentation. All these are comes under the configuration setup.
Yeah.
Okay, next about test approach. Test approach majorly focusing on uh, developing of test and whenever there are requirements which we have analyzed, right? So developing the scenarios because to do the testing and all, there are multiple scenarios we have to develop, multiple scenarios we need to consider. So the developing scenarios is what you need to see. At the same time, reviewing the documentation, acceptance criteria, and how to construct these test cases, requirement traceability matrix. All these things comes under the test approach. How are
Right.
we approaching is what we do. At the same time, we need to mention about how to prepare the test environment and creating test data, all that. Followed by this, last but not least, we need to run the testing environments by checking the pass and fail criteria. At the same time, review the test results, all that stuff. So these are the informations which we have to mention when we are working on the user acceptance testing. Is it clear to you, Ram? Right.
Yeah, clear.
Now, from here onwards, we need to update the UAT because especially as I mentioned here, there are two things. One is manual testing, second is automation testing. In manual testing, whatever the test cases, test plans, test scripts, finally the result, whatever we are updating under UAT, all these comes under one category. And whatever the tools are we using to do the testing, all these comes under the second category, right? So these are the two different categories we have. So hence we need to update the version history first, because when we are working on the application, there are multiple versions are taking place, isn't it? Right. So different versions will be taken place. So
Right.
whatever the versions are we going to take, because either it can be 1.2 or 2.2, right? So when, for example, we are working on healthcare claims, when
Right.
there is a document of healthcare claims, whenever we are submitted, uh, version to version, there are some changes might be taken place, maybe in coming time or something of that sort. Also, all this information we have to update under the version history, whatever the versions we have, followed by the dates, right? So at the same time, description of revision, right? So how are we describing this, right? How are we revising it? And what are the reasons for us to revise this, right? Reasons for revision, right? Who has prepared by, who has prepared. All these will be under the revision history, right? So this is 1.1. So once the revision history is done, the next is about further revisions. If there is any further revisions which are involved in it and which are included in it, so the further revisions and all everything will also be included in this further revisions, all that. Next one about here, you can see there is the information where we need to update, where we need to mention about the document sign off approvals, because as I told you earlier, whoever are responsible for the documentation to be accepted, because once we prepared user acceptance testing, someone has to accept that. Acceptance is must. So that
Right.
acceptance information followed by the details relating to the acceptance of that. So that information we have to update here, right? So this is what generally we see, right? So document sign off and approvals. So all this information will be updated under the 1.2, because it's not only about the further revisions, even document sign off and approval, that information should also be mentioned over the approvals here. Next, we need to mention about the document description over here, right? So whatever the documentation we have, right? So why and what documentation we have prepared, right? So this document description, why this user acceptance testing and for what purpose, and what are the steps are we going to consider while we are working on user acceptance testing, and what kind of objectives of this document which are prevailed in it. So how are we going to define this pass and fail, right? So all these comes under the document description, which is 2.1. Okay, so it's not only about the versions, all that, but it's also important for us to mention about the document description, whatever the document description we have. So relating to the particular project run, okay? Relating to the particular project, I am specifying this. Whichever the project we are working on, the claims related. So that information we have to update subsequently. Next, we need to update the summary of it, right? So project summary is also required. Ram, are you listening? Ram, are you there?
I'm here.
Okay. Right. So here you need to mention about the project summary. Project summary means whatever the project we are working on. So that the briefing over the project should also mention under the project summary. This is what something essentially needed when we are working on the application, all that. So
Right.
once the project summary, the next is list of features. Whatever the features are we working on, these are important, Ram.
Yeah.
2.1.2, these are all important for list of requirements, what we have and all that. So whatever the list of requirements do we have, so the list of requirements has to be updated subsequently. So whenever the list of requirements which were completed we have, the next is related documentation, because if there is any related documentation which was updated so far, whatever the related documentation do we have, all these things are comes under the related documentation part, because there are different documentations we prepare when we are working on the application. This is something when we follow the traditional practices of application development. Related documentation, whatever is needed. So all these things has to be updated here. At the same time, we need to update the list of features. What are all the features involved in the application? Those list of features has to be updated subsequently, followed by related documentation. At the same time, whatever the business and functional requirements which was identified for the project, because every project will have some business requirements, followed by business requirements, there will be some functional and non-functional requirements will be taken place. So business, functional and non-functional requirements will be updated over here. Along with this, we need to mention over the technical solution design, right? So whatever the technical solution designs do we have? So that will be updated over here. Followed by this test scripts, test plans, right? So all this information has to be updated in the list of features. Understood, Ram? Clear?
Right.
Ram, are you clear? Understood?
Yeah, I'm here.
Right. So this is all something relating to the list of features. Whatever the list of features relating for the project, that list of features we have to mention over here, right? So that's what it was, right? So general functionality, related documentation, business and functional requirements, right? So all these are all the part of list of features which we have to be updated. So after that, the next one about the scope of user acceptance testing. What is the possible scope do we have? Scope of user acceptance testing has to be mentioned here equally. Possibilities of developing the scope in reference to the user acceptance testing, that also has to be mentioned over here, right? So this is required. So possibility of scope of user acceptance testing, right? So all these things has to be mentioned. After that, we need to mention about the kind of application as well as the modules which are getting affected, because multiple applications are working on the environment. At the same time, every application will be lined up with different modules, isn't it?
Right.
Right. So will be lined up with different modules. So those modules has to be updated equally. Okay, so application followed by the kind of modules what we have. So those modules has to be updated here. So this is also one of the key and prominent element. Application points followed by application points, modules even.
Right.
So after that, once it is done, we need to mention over the features. What are the features to be tested and how this is to be tested? So that features to be tested should also be mentioned here. Right. So what are the features do we have, right? So how these features to be tested, right? So the features to be tested should also be mentioned when we are working on the application. But there are some features which are not to be tested. This is also there. Because if you remember in the beginning time, whenever I have explained you, at the type of test life cycle, if you remember, I told you, right? So
Yeah.
requirements which are possible for the testable means there are some testable requirements will be there. There are some non-testable requirements will also be there. Understand? Clear now, right?
Yeah.
Testable requirements are separate. Non-testable requirements will be as separate. So that information we have to update over here, right? So which are features to be tested and which are features not to be tested, right? So both we have to update, but major whatever the features we have taken this into testing into consideration, that we will be comparing about the expectation what customer has and all, right? So all these things are comes under this testing of the features, etc., come into existence. Next, we have to mention over the responsibilities, what who are the people who are working on the application and all that. So what kind of responsibilities do they have? So we need to mention about their name, right? At the same time, what kind of role are they playing? Mm, for example, Mr. Ram, right? So,
Yeah. Right.
right. So he's a test lead. Let me say, for example, test lead, right? So, for example, uh, Mr. Lakshman, right? For example, right? So he's test manager, for example, right? So, right. So this is how generally, right? So name and followed by the rules. At the same time, here the responsibilities. Being a test lead, whatever the responsibilities are you, whatever the responsibilities are you performing, right? Being a test lead. At the same time, whatever the responsibilities being a test manager, this respective individual is performing, right? So all this information we need to mention over the responsibilities. Understood, Ram? Clear? Right. Ram, are you clear?
Yeah. I'm here.
Right. So name we have to mention. At the same time, role we have to mention. Subsequently, we need to mention over the responsibilities. What are the different responsibilities these people were facing? These people were handling. So those responsibilities we have to update subsequently over here. So once the responsibilities, this is where it is important.
Yeah.
Configuration setup. Here we need to mention the configuration part. Configuration of the application. Here I
Right.
must tell you some points whenever we are working on the configuration setup. This is applicable for different things. For example, whenever we are working on a new application from the beginning, right? For example, uh, we are developing a new application which is beginning, right? Which is from the fresh. So we have to mention over the detailed description over the application what we are working on. That is point number one. We need
Yeah.
to work out the configuration. Second, there are some applications we come across where there are some legacy systems we have. So we are working from legacy systems to new applications. That's how generally the transformation are we taking on. So whenever we are working from legacy systems to the new applications, whatever the what we call whatever the data transformation are we doing taking and whatever the what and how this data migration is being taken place. So in this data migration and all, there are some hardware and software configurations which has to be tested equally. Because unless until if there is no hardware and software, testable environments, tools and all everything, that configuration setup won't be successful, right? So that a complete understanding over the migration part of the project, including the data migration, the kind of tables are we using on, the kind of infrastructure which was used for the earlier application to the now. All this information we need to update. This is
Right.
what we call it as configuration setup. Understood, Ram? Right.
Yeah.
So hardware and software configuration setup uh, is what it was mentioned, right? So this is what generally hardware and software information, all that. After that, test environment, right? In which test environment are we going to test it? So that information we have to update. The test environment based upon the kind of application we are working on, or the kind of claims processing when we are working on that. So whatever the testing environment do we have? So that testing environment will be uh, hmm, the test environment will be mentioned over here, right? So what are the testing environment and all everything? So that will be mentioned over here.
Right.
At the same time, testing tools, right? So what kind of tools are we using, right? So there people can be used Selenium. There are list of tools around. One is Selenium
Right.
for the testing we use. You know that.
Yeah.
And something next is Appium. There is another tool called Appium because both are open source tools. Even Selenium and as is Appium. Appium, 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 right? Appium. That is also one of the tool. And one of the tool which is using nowadays for the applications and all we are using is called Tosca, Tosca, Tosca. Of course, there are many other tools we have, but I've just mentioned three tools. Of course, we have other tool called load runner, etc. Right. So there are different tools and all. So whichever the tool are we going to use, those details has to be mentioned here, right? So testing tool details has to be mentioned. At the same time, we need to mention about the kind of training, whatever the kind of training we have and all, and how this training has been provided. We need to provide the training to the people who are involving in it. At the same time, the kind of requirements which are involved while we are working on the application development. Subsequently, what are the kind of security aspects are we taking for user acceptance testing to create with, including mentioning about the user IDs, right? So at the same time, the kind of passwords are we using? Because especially for healthcare projects, the major challenge, I don't say major challenge, major restrictions comes under the healthcare data. Because as far as HIPAA rules and regulations is concerned, no healthcare data has to be given outside, right? So this is the rule, fundamental rule. That's the reason why whatever the process we follow, especially in the field of healthcare, everything will be under code numbers. You know that, right? There are different procedure codes, diagnosis codes. There are different claim codes we use. For example, 837, 835, right? 832, 271, 272, right? So different codes. 832 we use for, right? So different
Right.
code numbers we use, right? So this is all something relating to the security of the application, where health information as well as the kind of treatment which was given will not be shown outside on the screen. This is all will be shown based on the code number. So based on the code number, people will identify, right? So what in which category this comes under, all that. So this is all something relating to the security of the application, wherein um, to protect the health data, etc. Right? So all these things are comes under here, where the security aspects and all everything will be taken into consideration over this. Next, about documentation. Of course, if there is any documentation of that sort, generally documentation will be written. Next, we will be mentioning about the schedule and as well as the milestones, right? So what are the milestones are we going to achieve it? What are the different milestones do we have, right? So when we have started a particular work and when was the completed? Because unless until if you are not mentioning about the milestones, your application won't be successful. Because for every milestone, there are some targets you keep. For the first month, what is that you want to achieve? For the next 2-3 months, what is that you want to achieve? So milestones we have to update. That is essentially required. So we need to mention over the milestones followed by the start date. So when is this started, right? So when is this completed, right? Start date, end date, completion date. All this has to be mentioned over the milestones here. This is also one of the key and prominent element we have to update. Next, about test approach, right? So how are we doing the testing, right? So approach, what approach are we following to work on the requirements, all that? Or how are we doing the test approach here, in what conditions this test approach are we working on, followed by developing the test cases, because that is all I have already explained you how to develop the test cases and all. Everything I have explained earlier in the before sessions and all I have explained you. Developing the test cases. To develop that, generally you need to know about analyzing up the requirements. Of course, developing test scenarios. In the last session video, I have explained that to you. At the same time, reviewing up the documents that even explained you. Next, we need to derive the acceptance criteria, because whatever the work are we going to take, that has to be accurate. So for accuracy purpose and all, reviewing the acceptance criteria is also required. Next, we need to construct the test cases, whatever the test cases we are developing and all, so that construction of test cases is also required here. Next, requirement traceability matrix. Requirement traceability matrix is nothing but how you are going to trace the requirement between use cases to test cases, all that. Next, we need to mention over the test scripts writing, right? So preparation of the test, followed by the environment here. At the same time, testing data is also equally needed. How to create the test data, right? At the same time, completing the test procedures, right? So running the testing. So all this information means whatever the information you have updated in the test cases and test plans in the earlier sessions, whatever we discussed, those final results will be updated in this seventh column, seventh this thing. Understood, Ram? Right?
Right.
Are you listening?
Yeah.
Yeah. So whatever the test cases, test plans, test scripting and all, everything we did, right? Earlier, before that.
Yeah.
Because those are all will be done first. After that, we come for user acceptance testing. So
Right.
whatever we have done, that information will be updated here, so that it is all repetitive. Of course, the reason why I'm explaining, because earlier I have explained the same thing. So this is how generally this user acceptance testing is what we need to update at the time of closure of the application. So this is all about user acceptance testing.